I'm telling you that. Well, we refer to
And I haven't changed my name.
So hi guys, how are y'all? Hey guys. 6 minutes. I'm really appreciative that nobody from Haywood County Sheriff's Department was out. I apologize for being late. I got a late start out of Raleigh and then caught up in traffic coming this long way. So thank you all for being here. I try to talk loud. I try to go a little bit faster at the beginning because I know you've been waiting longer, so we can do that. One, appreciate everybody that came showing up. It's not a beautiful night out there, so it's nice of you to get out and do that. Really appreciate these guys over here coming out. Sandy Ellsworth is with the Division of Mental Health, Development Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services, a long title. So is Suzanne Thompson, who is with that same division. I'm not going to go through the whole name again. And then Renee Rada is with our Division of Medical Assistance. They're the experts. They know the detail of the waiver. They know how to talk about it, and they're here for, one, to hear what you have to say, but also to be able to bring it back in our conversation. So this is going forward. So we appreciate them taking their time tonight being here also. We also know that there's some people from Smoky Mountain here. So I want to identify, raise your hands, because we don't ask, Brian, who's their CEO, is here, so we don't ask that the LME MCO show up. What we say to them is that that's their decision, but we think it's terrific when they do. And what's really important to note is that every one of our listening sessions, and this I think is the 8th or 9th one that we've done, and we've had really good representation from the LME MCO. So that's, I think, a very positive sign. I want to hear what people have to say and understand what's going on. So let me tell you why we're doing this and what we're trying to achieve. We are here to listen, and we want to hear what you have to say. But as we say everywhere else, as a state bureaucrat, we'll get a shot to talk a little bit first, so we're going to do that. Tell you about what our vision is, what we're trying to ask for and understand what people want to say, and then really spend the time hearing what you got to say and writing that down and go forward. So here's the gist of it. We are on these listening tours because we want to hear about our IDD system. We want to hear what people think about it, what can improve, what's good, what should change, how you should think about it, how we should think about it. We are doing this because my boss, Secretary Bosch, has been real clear that it's time to develop a real vision to how we continue to improve that system. We've been doing a lot of work around our mental health and substance use systems over the past year. And it's not because people had forgotten and not because we weren't working on the IDD system, but there's some priorities that we had to address there. Now, our goal is to hear what you have to say and spend time trying to adjust our system as we go forward. What we tell everybody when we start is that we want to hear everything you have to say about everything about our system. It's not just about the innovations waiver. It's not just about one part of it. It's about the entire system. We will be able to do some things you talk about. We'll be able to not do other things that you talk about. And our goal is to tell you what we can and can't do and why, and then try to work with you to continue to improve it as we go forward. It is not just about the innovations waiver. I'm going to try to not acronym a lot, but it's not just about that. So I would want to remind you that there are other ways that we fund IDD services. We fund them through what we call the ICF program. That can be group homes, and it's also how we fund our state facilities. In J. Apperson Riddle Center is funded through the ICF program, and our other state facilities are. It is a big part of the funding that we have for our system. It's almost $500 million that we spend through that system. We also fund a lot of services through our innovations waiver, which is And one of the rare things that happens in federal government and state government, it actually is what it says it is. It's a waiver of those really restrictive institutional ICF rules to create a home and community-based program. So you'll hear people call it the home and community-based waiver. We call it the innovations waiver. And so that's another part of how we fund our system. There is also state funds that go out through our Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. We send out somewhere around $340 million throughout the state in pure state money for mental health, DD, and substance abuse. We're probably spending somewhere around $140 million in the IPD system now. Exact numbers, but that's a pretty good indicator of that. And in some places, there's significant county money. I suspect that's not true in this region, but a lot of county money in some other areas that fund services. And we also have another way of using Medicaid money, something called B3 services. It gets a little technical, but essentially it is that when our managed care entities, those LME MCOs, I should remind you what that means, local management entity, managed care organization, when they save money through their management of this waiver, the bigger waiver, the fact that they have a managed care waiver, they can reinvest those dollars in something called B3 services. And that is developing in counties and across the state at different levels, but it is a possibility using services as we do that. So when we talk today, we want to talk about the entire system, but we understand a lot of what people want to talk about is the innovations waiver, but we want to be clear, that's not what this is about. It's about the entire DD system. But we do have some things that are really important to us about the innovations waiver. We have a goal of submitting amendments to that waiver in March, April of, keep bugging a little bit, because we make sure we get it right. We'll just try this, late spring of 2015, with the goal of implementing in January 1st of 2016, those amendments. Now, that sounds like a long way away, but in our Medicaid world, in submitting stuff to the federal government, CMS is the agency that we submit to. It takes a long time to get things in and out. So that might sound like a long time, but it's not. It will take us time. So in that process, we also have another group in Raleigh we call a stakeholder group. We were really creative with that. Stakeholder group that is made up of LME-FCO representatives, provider organizations, and families and people with disabilities. In fact, we're pretty excited about how we got families and people with disabilities here. We went to our CFACs, who are sponsoring a lot of these around the state, and asked them to randomly get us names of people. Part of that was because we often get the same people showing up as representatives from family and consumer organizations. Nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing, and we've got some of those folks. But we wanted to hear from people that really don't often show up. And we actually have three of the people that came from there, frankly, I had never met before. And that's a great thing, because we have people with very fresh perspectives. We have to explain ourselves a lot to those folks in terms of the language we use, which is really helps us think about things differently. So that's a good sign that we have those folks. That stakeholder group's designed so that as we're thinking about the innovation waiver changes that come from you, that we hear from folks, that we hear from people, and part of our vision what we want to do, we're not just going in a back room somewhere with state staff trying to write this without getting that feedback. So our goal is that group will be sort of our checker. So we'll bring back stuff to them. They'll hear what we've heard from you guys, some of our ideas. They'll say good, bad, or indifferent what they think about it. But we use that as a process group. In fact, they're meeting again for the third time on Friday, 1 to 4 o'clock on the Brown building on the Dix campus. You're all welcome to show up. It's a long ride, so I don't know if you want to, but you should know about that. And you get the sort of detail of what they talk about. We post them. We're not always consistent how we post it, but we do post those on our website. Hopefully get better. And if you want that information, we'll give you names that you can go to get that as we're going forward. So we'll let you know that process is happening. So let me tell you, a couple things that we think. We have a vision, and but what we don't have is we don't have this really lofty vision statement, because I've been around, and you guys have been around for a long time too, and you know sometimes we can get in a room and we can decide we want to write this really beautiful vision statement, and we spend a whole bunch of time worrying about whether is or it is the right word, and we often don't get to the end of what we're trying to achieve. So we sort of laid it out fairly simply, and we're basically saying is that what we believe our system ought to be about is how do we support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the community. And that's about supporting people. It's about how people work. It's about how people are engaged in activities. It's about where they live, and it's about really supporting people. So we don't have a big lofty thing. We may have to at some point do that, but we're trying to keep it simpler because it seems that the more complex we get, frankly, often we confuse what we do in that. So we're trying to be a little bit more real about what we have. So if you've got great ideas about a vision statement that everybody will love, send it to us, but we're sticking with the simple right now. What we want to emphasize, and what I hope you heard in that short statement, was that we understand that the IDD system, for people with developmental disabilities, ought to be about support. It's not about a rehabilitation model. It's not about making people better or curing people. It's not about those things. Often in our mental health and substance abuse world, because it's the accurate description, is we talk about recovery. And that is absolutely what we want to talk about, because that's an important component of value that people have. And certainly if people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have a co-occurring substance use issue or mental health issue, we want to make sure those recovery values are part of our system. But fundamentally, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's about support. And we're going to make sure we do that. Now, that does not mean we believe people are stagnant and that people can't improve in how they interact with their communities. It doesn't mean that we don't expect people to achieve more and that we shouldn't push and try to do that. But what it means is that we don't think that we should create supports and services with the intention of pulling them away because people recover. Those supports and services ought to support people long-term in our communities, and that's what we believe in, the value we have. We also value self-determination, but often we get very confused about that self-determination word. And we think about it and we use it. I've heard a lot of people use it in ways that are really detrimental, but essentially the value that comes out of that is that people with disabilities and their families ought to have the option of controlling the resources that are available for them that the state or any other organization puts out, but they have a responsibility. And that responsibility is to interact with their community, use other resources when possible, and be good stewards of that public money. That's a responsibility we all have. So we have to have both in both hands. We have that accountability and that authority that we want folks to have, but we also want people to have that responsibility. So we value that, and we want to make sure, as we describe what we do, that we're accurate in that description going forward. We know, and I think we've heard it across the state, is that there are things in our system that aren't working as well as we'd like them to work. And you'll tell us some of those tonight as we go forward. There are things that, for instance, we know that our system's too complex, that it's really hard to navigate. We hear it from people all the time. And one of the things that I've heard that just absolutely drives me wild is I've heard from providers who run both group homes using the ICF model and innovation waiver services, and they'll tell us that it's much more difficult to provide innovation waiver services than it is to do ICF services. And the word I use, that's just stupid. Because we're waiving the more complex rules of ICF to provide services that the innovations waiver should provide. So we ought to make that less difficult to do. Now, I want to be real clear when we talk about these, is that almost everything that the LME-MCO will do that is more complicated to utilize is because we as the state have created it. So often what happens is that you blame them, they blame us, because they should, and we haven't figured out how to break that. So I want to be clear about that, is that a lot of things that happen are about system design. There are things that we put in place, and we have to rethink how we do them, and we have to work that. So one of the values we have is that our services ought to be flexible, that they ought not be so rigid that people can't move in and out of things, and that they can't control them. So we have to think about how best to do that. In particular, when we think about the innovations waiver, it ought to be really flexible, because that's what the design is. I think we know is that what we currently have is not sustainable. So I put it out there, is that what we do right now, and this is the way the innovations waiver services and frankly our entire community-based managed care waiver works, is that we give a pot of money to the LME-MCO. That's not the right way to say it. We have a PM process, per member per month, a rate setting process that goes on, and at the end, we come up with the amount of money of Medicaid money they get. We have an allocation of state dollars that, by the way, is not based upon anything in reality, it's based upon history. So some LME MCOs get a lot more per capita of state money than others do, and it has nothing to do with what anybody's done, it's just history. And I don't know how we change that, but it's something we may want to talk about. But we give them a pot of money, and on the mental health and mental health side, primarily, as you think about this, is that there's an entitlement for certain services, and those entitlements are based upon a per capitation rate that we give them, and they have to figure out how to provide that services if you have Medicaid. For people with IDD, other than the ICF, some people say that's an entitlement. I'm not so sure it is, because if it's not a bed, there really isn't no entitlement to it. But for the IDD, we give them slots. They get a certain amount of innovation waiver slots, and it's based on a historical budget of how much that is. It isn't $135,000 per slot, by the way, so don't think that's what it is. It's based on what the average costs have been. And then we ask them to manage that, but we really don't give them great tools. If they save money, they can't get additional slots. That's also done. If they spend more money, they might get more money the next year, but it really doesn't help them in terms of adding additional services. So we have no way of doing that right now, and there really has not been the investment from the General Assembly to go forward. So when I say it's not sustainable, our current system isn't sustainable to ever get to the people that are on a waiting list. That's the value that we have, is that we have thousands of people in North Carolina's waiting list, and it's just not right. What we've created is a system that is entirely inequitable. So if you happen to have wound up, through good fortune, to have an innovations waiver slot, despite things people may say aren't right about it, it's still a pretty good deal. You get a lot of services, the ability to get those services, and it can make a big difference. If you happen not to have one of those, and you're not in an ICF program, you struggle. You want to wait a minute. These guys in the back want to do something about that just as much as we do, because it's not fair, it's not equitable. We need to figure out how to change that. So it's another value we have. We want to create a system that's equitable. Finally, I'll just add this, there are a whole bunch of other things that we should talk about, but I'll add this, is that our system isn't very flexible. We think, and we really want to hear from you, we think the best way to deal with this, starting with the innovations waiver, ultimately, throughout our entire service system, we believe this, is that we need to create something that is an individual budget. So that if you're an individual family member, person with disability, and we go through a process which is based upon assessment of need and individual circumstance, we have to do both, and we come to an agreement about how much money we can spend, and there has to be a process by which it is due process, but ultimately we'll come to that, and it won't be what everybody wants, but ultimately it'll be what people need. We come to an agreement with that is, and I use this number only because we use it all the time. It is not a number that we thought about yet, all right? So this isn't, that makes it easy for math. So suppose it's $50,000 that we have available resources to spend. What you ought to know as a family member, as a provider, as an individual, is that's the amount of money that will continue to be available. That we're not going to base what your future is upon some ability to write a better plan or some ability to figure out what service definition is the right one. We're going to base it upon what that need is and the circumstances. And then inside of that, we're going to write a person-centered plan that makes sense for the individual. And it's really going to be about a person-centered plan. And my dream is that what we do is we create service definitions that are so flexible that we don't fight over things like whether it's a personal care service or it's a habilitation service or if it's some other thing. What we wind up arguing about, not even arguing, is understanding is that if it meets health and safety needs, because we have to assure that in a waiver, if it's logical and it meets the needs of the individual to progress, honestly, from the state system, we shouldn't care a lot about that. Because it ought to be driven by the individual and family, it ought to be driven by those values. Now, we're not going to get it so flexible. And my goal would be to say you have a person-centered plan, that's a service definition, who cares about everything else we do? We're not going to get there. But that's the goal, that's where we want to head. So we want to create systems in our system that allows people to manage their lives rather than manage service definitions. And that's really what the goal is. Now, we got a long way to get there. A lot of things we have to do, and it's not just about innovations waiver, but that's where we'll start, because that's the one place we can make a difference. But the goal is ultimately that that's how we'll deliver services, no matter what the funding stream is. That people will know. We'll have a history, we'll have continuity going forward. So that's the vision. That's what we're thinking about. That's what we believe right now. Now, we're open to all sorts of conversation about what works and doesn't in your mind, other things that we should be thinking about, how do we get there. Part of what we say in every one of these meetings is that the best way for us to hear you is that if we have an honest, nice conversation. The worst way for us to hear you is that if you're telling us how lousy we are. Now, you can tell me, because I signed up for the gig, all right? But that's part of my deal. Don't tell them that, all right? Because these guys are here, and there are folks that are going to be here when I'm long gone. Well, maybe not, if they've signed retirement for that. But they'll be working state government once, all the political stuff's done. And they're trying to get it right. So be nice. And I'd say is that be nice to the LME-MCO. You might not like what they're doing, but they're trying their dangest to get it right. So if we have an honest conversation, one that is respectful of each other, I think we can get a lot further. The other thing that we've heard from some of these places is that some people get really into details about their individual circumstances. One thing I can't do or won't do, and frankly nobody here can, will, is try to address an individual issue that you have a problem with. Now, we can talk about it later. We can, give you emails and the right people to talk to. The MCO can talk about it, but we can't do it here. And it's not fair to us to try to do it because we don't know circumstances. Not fair to anybody at that point. It's fair to say, I'm not sure I like what's going on, and I'd like to see some changes, and here's what the big issues are. And maybe we can talk about it later. But if we really get down into the details of individuals' lives, sometimes it's embarrassing to the individuals to happen to be here. It's just not the right way to go. We don't get anything out of it long term. Now, we say we're going to be here from 6 to 8:30. We started late because I'm late, so we'll be here longer if we need to. But I'll tell you, if you happen to finish early, we won't complain. But we'll stay after and have conversations if we need to do that. All of us are committed to doing that part. And in the process, it is listening, but I'll reserve the right to sort of move you along, or sort of shift the gears if it's getting out of hand. And we might ask you questions. So if you don't want to answer questions, that's fine. Tell me you don't want to answer it. But if we get into a process and you tell us something, we want to learn more about it, we might ask that question. We're going to record everything you write. Renee's the writer. She's got the best freaking handwriting on these boards of anybody I've ever seen. So when Renee writes, we understand it. If I were writing, I have no clue. So we'll write everything we have. We'll feed it back to you through themes across what we put on the website. So you'll see that. So we capture everything, but we won't write everything on the website that you said. But we capture themes, and you'll have another shot at it. On the innovations waiver, one last thing is that we'll do these stakeholder groups. Eventually, we'll go in a back room somewhere with our partners in the MCOs. We'll write stuff, and we'll write a waiver. They'll write it. And when they write a waiver, we'll have to post it for 30 days for people to review it. So you'll have this input. You'll have the chance to send us emails, call, do whatever you want to do. Continue to have that kind of conversation. But on a waiver, you'll have another formal shot. Because that public input we have to have for CMS, and we have to show how we've listened to that input and what we've done with it. So that's our goal. So I'm going to quit talking now and just say, let's start. And who wants to jump in? And listen to people, wait a second. But go ahead, George. George, let's start with George today.
Well, you addressed, this is broad, but you addressed as you were speaking regarding, or if you have this slide, if you have an innovation or this slide, et cetera, feel good about that. As you know, you also said waiting list, magic term. I think two things. One, I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there is truly a comprehensive waiting list for people waiting to receive IDD services in the state of North Carolina. Certainly none that can be validated. Secondly, as there are people waiting for services, the key thing is, people, IDD individuals aren't stopping. They continue to come from birth to a point where they're getting ready to exit the public school systems, And right now, and I know this is the case, in fact, I know a colleague of mine who has a meeting next week with school personnel and parents that is a vocational service provider. And consequently, there are no ADVP slots, there are no innovation labor slots. And as he and I were talking, the question is, what do you tell parents and school personnel about where those children, kids, young adults, whatever, are going as they exit the public school system, when in fact, the impression, and this is their concern, is that, oh, we aren't serving anymore. We aren't going to serve people coming out of the school system. And that's the impression, parents, guardians are developing. So what would you say would be the response to parents, guardians, school personnel when there are no, quote, slots funding available to serve them in the community?
I think the only answer is the honest answer right now is that the state and their partners are trying to figure out a system that makes sure that we have equitable services and that people coming out of school aren't just dropping off a cliff. But what we know right now is we don't have it. And if we continue on a path we are right now, the way we've designed this system, it won't exist.
So do we give them the 1-800 your number, call Dave?
Well, give them Renee's number.
Well, I mean, in all honesty,
No, that's exactly right.
in all honesty, as a provider, we can sit here and talk all night, and we can talk with our LMEs, MCOs, and they're up against the wall. And consequently, when parents and guardians talk, people tend to listen a little bit more.
Well, I think less of a flippant answer. I think you do want them to call the LMEMCO because they need to know who's out there. That's part of their responsibility. They know that. So
I got you.
that's one of the things to do. But I think the other thing is, again, why it's so important to do this is to make sure that we are hearing from people everywhere across the state. So one way we could have done it is to have several meetings in Raleigh, and we would have gotten little or no variety of input. The secretary was real clear is that the goal is to get out and talk to people about the real people that have real issues, that understand what's happening. Take that back and let's think about how we design a system. Again, I'm not going to pick on Brian. I'm going to say to him is that he's in a rock and hard place. He doesn't get the resources that he needs to do this, and we have to design a system that creates the expectation that we're going to reinvest those in that way, and that's what we're trying to figure out is how do you create that expectation. Now, it will require changes, and changes in the way we do business, and part of that is, for a lot of people who have intellectual disabilities, they're eligible for Medicaid services, but if you don't have a waiting in a slot or an ICF, the Medicaid service you get are very limited. There are probably some other ways we can do that. D3 has some promise, but it's not going to cover everybody. And it's not going to support everybody. So we have to change that around. So I will not call on you again.
You need to tell them, you have to go vote. I mean, you've got 3 weeks to convince people to vote. That's the first thing everybody needs to do. And we take all of our family members and our loved ones. And the other thing is written, email, and phone communication with our elected representatives. He can only do what money the citizens elect our representatives to give him to. So we are basically saying when we vote or don't vote, our people are important to you or not. And there is a big impression, in my opinion, based on what I've seen from emails. In Raleigh, parents don't complain, so therefore there's no problem. So your best thing is to educate parents.
Just to address that, because I think it's a really important point. And then we are, I work for the governor, and I work for the secretary who works directly with the governor. So we obviously have a belief system in terms of what we're trying to achieve. What I think the governor would tell you and the secretary would tell you is that disability isn't a partisan issue. How do we address the issues are going to, really it doesn't matter who's involved. The point is, how do we figure out the right system design to move forward? I will tell you, I spent a long time with the ARC, doing a lot of work, and there are people of both parties who have been champions And there are people in both parties who have been just absolutely lousy. And so you've got to know the people you're voting for. I think that's exactly right, get to know that. But we can do better with the system design. We can create something that makes a difference, and so that's what we're trying to do right now. And that's part, I think, vote, express your opinion, will help us in terms of thinking about what works in the system and will be the best for you. Yes, ma'am. Sorry. Yeah. Two parts.
One, as you talked about person-centered planning and setting up the services based on that person-centered planning, I thought that's what we were already doing. So that's my understanding is when we're sitting down there doing that plan, we're developing that plan based on what we have available to use. My fear would be if we reduced the amount of funds, then the quality of service or support is going to go down. So just if we're able to serve 100,000 more people, what kind of quality of care are they going to get in the community? Is it going to be? So you have to think about that, weighing that out. The other piece, just as a feedback, is we're doing self-determination, and I would just again say that I'm seeing that as a way of maintaining a better quality of care for my loved one anyway. So, and I think that comes back to the family and to the client or my son who has the disability. He's getting to make choices in his life of who's working with him and how they work with him. And we're getting good quality of care because we're working there as a team. So it's not a us and them. And so I just would champion that. We've done it since April now, about 6 months, and really seeing how much better quality of care.
That's great. I think that is the value of it. We want to make that easy for people to do. That's one of the things that I think sometimes we make it too complicated, but we make it easy for people to do. I should have said this. When we talk about doing individual budgets, you would assume that if you do it based on need and you do it based upon individual circumstances, based upon where current budgets are, if you want to wait right now, there will be movement up and down. Our opinion is this is not about a budget exercise, that's why. Part about it is create predictability, to understand where we're at, and the predictability for the long term, for both the individual, the provider, and the states who are going forward. So here's what I've learned and I've heard and I understand over the years about the current, let me say, the way the waiver used to work before it was under the managed system. Right? So we go to the General Assembly and ask them to add more capital. And what they would say to us is that, how do you guarantee me that if you tell me it's going to be an average cost of $50,000, that next year it's not going to be $60,000? And a good reason to say that. Because the truth is, we go in, it would be $50,000 or 40, whatever. The next year it'd be 5% more.
Well, that's inflation.
Actually, the truth is that it wasn't inflation. No, what it was is that, and I say this is because people are smart. And I also want to, so I would say this part of it, there are people that will sometimes say that families are greedy. I think that's absolutely a horrible thing to say. Families aren't greedy. Families want what's best for their son and daughter. And sometimes the way people measure that is by how much money do people get within a service rather than how the quality of service is. And that's not a diss on the family member. That frankly is just human nature. It's that, you want the best, so you push for the best. Well, most of that wasn't inflationary increase. That was just creepage in what services people got. And it wasn't necessarily because what they got, the other service they got were what they were needed. It's because that's what people talk about. So the truth is that, if we could do it this way, which I don't think we can, if you do it this way, I would say that you wouldn't move anybody down and you just get everybody in the budget cycle. We can't do that because CMS won't let us. So if you do an individual budget, we're going to have to work with people to figure out what that real limit is. Our goal would be that it's not a fast titration down, and that there's a wide variety that tells us that, if it's over 40%, we're not going to drop you down 40%, we're not going to do that, things like that. So those are the ideas we're looking for. But there'll also be people that will have a higher budget than what they currently have, because that might be what's needed, what's indicated. Doesn't mean that people have to spend it all, but it might mean that's that. So the goal is to create something that's equitable, that's predictable. Right now, there absolutely is no predictability in terms of the service level that people get. And we need to give our managed care organizations something so that they have it there, but what we also have to do is to give the General Assembly some confidence that if we tell them that next year it's going to cost you $500 million, which is what the Innovations Waiver essentially does, it's going to cost $500 million. And if you want to serve 500 more people, it'll cost you another 10 million sigma, whatever the number is, I'm not doing the math in my head, and have a confidence that that is true. Because I do believe this, the current members of the General Assembly, our administration wants to invest. Believe that this is a system that has to have more money into it, it has to have more service. But you can't do it unless you have some confidence in what we say will be the budget. And that's really the big point about the money side of it, isn't it?
Oh, well, I'm a parent as well as the owner of a provider agency. One of the things the legislators and everybody's got to realize though, is as parents age, we end up needing more help with our loved one, as we go through cancer, as we, Alzheimer's, any things, that's gonna have to be factored in.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
I want to be real clear. That's why I asked that we say need and individual circumstance. Because you've got to combine both. You can't just do it based on need because circumstances change.
Well,
And so where you family may today be able to give all sorts of support, and that's what you want to do, 10 years from now, that might not be possible. So it's got to be based upon those two things. And that's really an important distinction, which I was writing down.
Absolutely, and that wasn't even what I came to
Oh,
talk
come on.
about. The last time I gave you an 8-page handout, and this time it's only 4 pages.
Oh, man, this is great.
So, this stuff is so important. Like I said, I'm talking as a parent and also as a provider. And we own one of the bigger agencies in the state. Agency expenses and reimbursement rates, killing us. We're doing everything we can to control our expenses, but our queues are just overloaded with paperwork. And I know you've heard this before. Stuff's got to simplify. All my queues are doing now is forms and paper and forms and paper. And they're tied to their desks all day long. They hate it. I've had queues quit and go back to being direct care staff because they didn't get a special ed degree so they could write some paper and do some forms. And it's just ridiculous. That's basically all they're doing. They race out and do a visit and come right back. They don't have time to spend with the families, with the service recipients, with the employees. And I'll tell you, that's how Medicaid fraud is caught, when the queues are hanging around, and when the care coordinators are hanging around, making visits, and that kind of thing is where your Medicaid fraud is being caught. But again, our queues have got to have a break, and I've given you detailed lists of the paperwork that needs to go away. And that's another way to control costs. If my queues, they've had to have much smaller caseloads because of all this extra paperwork and all the stuff that the case managers used to do, that my queues do now. If we can simplify and get rid of all the unnecessary stuff, all the extra garbage, you don't have to give us rate increases, which I know there's not a budget for. But again, we can't keep doing it because our expenses are going up. I don't know what affordable care is going to do to us. Starting in January, we've got all of our other expenses are creeping up. Because that's just natural. So we've got to have help with that. And again, more paperwork and more bureaucracy doesn't equate to better services or supports. It does not. Families are served better when I've got queues that are fluent in sign language, ABA, VB, PECS. I can go in and train on special diets and nutritional supplementation. I don't have time. My queues don't have time. So again, that's extra stuff that my families are not getting and my service recipients are not getting. And they used to and they don't anymore. That's a shame because again, that can really up the quality and that can really up, these folks becoming more independent and better outcomes. And that's what we're all about. The second thing I've got to talk about, NCI, that 3-year moratorium, that was supposed to end in September, and
We've got your letter.
Mary Tripp called me last week about that. Well, I don't know how many more, I'm telling you, give me that thing, tell me what needs to be done. Let's shorten that thing to 1 month, to like 1 hour of training, stick it in with core comps, get rid of this special trainer. Now Part B, you've got to have special trainers because that's got to be hands-on, and people have got, but again, for Part A, stick that in core comps. I mean, it's just ridiculous, the requirement. To get an instructor, you have to pay $500. They have to go through the class.
We don't disagree.
Get rid of that stuff fast as you can. I'm telling you, every provider agency in the state will leave you alone. And
That's
we
not
would send you love notes and flowers and stuff. I mean, really help us. It would just make such a, it's just so much unnecessary.
So look, can I just, if you don't mind, just respond, I'll go right back to you. So the paperwork issue, we can do things now, and we're working on doing those things, we're working on LME MCOs. I will tell you again that when we come to these meetings, I feel like I have this sort of deja vu to when we meet with the CEOs of the LMEMs here. Because what they tell us is exactly what you say to us, which is quit doing all the freaking paperwork and all the other requests that you have. We generate that stuff. It's a bizarre thing that happens is that every time you seem to tell people that we need to reduce that, somebody finds another way to increase it. And it's somewhere in organizations too. It's the way bureaucracies work. So I have to admit, I am, of the things that I thought would be most difficult coming to this job, because it's one of the things I started out with the value on, it has been an absolute shock to me about how hard it is to reduce those regulatory burdens. And that is really, we're the culprit. Now, I think we're figuring out better how to get to it, but we're the culprit. The other thing, though, is that for a system design, I really do believe, and again, there are concerns that people should have about individual budgets that we have to talk about. But one of the best things about individual budget we can do is that we can eliminate some of that. And we actually would have to eliminate it to do the individual budget. The work gets done on the front end. What's the need? What's the individual circumstance? We figure out what that slot is. What is it that, if we all agree with it, say we all agree with it, then there's a lot of stuff other than just the health and safety things that CNS requires that don't have to be done. I will say this, I'm not going to ask anybody to do it, but if I'm a managed care organization, and I know this is how much money that I'm spending, and you're meeting health and safety, I don't care anymore. What I care about is the quality of life, that people are getting what they need. So a lot of this junk, this 15-minute increment stuff, all of the other things that we cause people to do, we can get rid of it. It allows for real payment, which is one of the things that we want to do. We want to stop this. We don't want to create a managed care system that sets a capitation for LME MCOs and we continue to keep the service in a provider world. That doesn't make sense. We want to pay for good outcomes. So that's where we're trying to go. There are things we can do now before we get there. We're going to try to do those. But the big change can come if we make these changes early. Yes, ma'am.
And so while you're getting rid of things,
What else?
we are being monitored by everybody from God down, and we don't need to be nationally accredited anymore. It is a very expensive thing that we all go through.
Stressful.
That is not meaningful.
So it's a good point. I want to make sure about it. So where we're at is this, and this is the kind of feedback we want. I believe, and I think our MCO partners believe this, if you're nationally accredited, it needs to count for something other than the fact that you get to play, right? Because right now, all national accreditation does is allow you to be in the network. It ought to mean something more. Now, I use this word deemed status, which is the people do. It ought to, if you're nationally accredited, we ought to take something away.
We're being monitored money time.
Well, I don't think we take it all away, but we might be able to take parts of it. In fact, I will tell you that early this morning phone call with part of our team was that. So come back with recommendations rapidly, because we need to get them in the budget cycle, of if you were going to say that national accreditation counted for more than just being able to play, what can we get rid of? And what legislative change would have to be made to do that? Because that's the other issue right now is in legislation, so we have to figure that out. Now, the other side of that is, if you say, you don't need to be nationally accredited, and we're going to continue to monitor the process, well, that's one thing you can do. But then the question I have, and this is really the question that we'd like to get from people, is that, so if you say national accreditation doesn't happen, my guess is most providers will still go through national accreditation. One of them is that because other agencies might require it. Two, if you've been nationally accredited and you take it away, and I'm a family member and I'm thinking about your services, I might wonder, did all of a sudden you as an agency become less good? Now, maybe not, but I'm afraid that happens. So I'm not sure. I think maybe the genie's out the bottle and we've required accreditation for so long that by saying pull it back would actually not really help you, because I think you almost have to do it anyway. It would be sort of to compete with the cost to do that. So I think the better answer, at least right now, but we surely want to hear this, is to figure out how we can make it count for more, so that you get less. So when you're struggling and you're going through all of the headaches about accreditation, you can sit there and say, well, it does mean something, you know. I may not get as much monitoring, or I may get delayed a certain period of time, or this part of the monitoring won't have to be done. that's what we're looking for, is those kind of recommendations. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to the queues, having so much work and all along those lines, and then it not being a recovery program, that you understand all that. The target pops we do every year, if they're the same target population every year, does it change? We're doing 50 of them, you know. Authorizations every 90 days. They're not recovering. We have to ask for those same services every 90 days. In the ICFs, every 6 months, we're having to tell you their diagnosis again, because really the LOC is all it is the diagnosis. It doesn't tell you anything else. Those diagnoses don't change. Things like that would be really nice to get rid of as a queue.
I think those are
Once a
really
year.
tangible recommendations. There are a couple of things, and I'm not going to get it right, but in the ICF issue, there is a requirement about something. I don't think the LOC has to be done every 6 months.
Yeah,
Federal
LOC
requirement.
has to be done every 6
Right,
months.
but I'm not sure that's the federal requirement. I think that might be something we require. But what we're doing, we're looking into that to try to figure out what is the federal requirement, what can we take off,
And the doctor has to sign it,
Right.
and they don't want to sign it.
Oh, no, and they're just,
Yeah.
there are things that are, that just don't make any sense. They're not common sense. I will tell you, the target population issue, we get beat up on that every time we meet with the CEOs too, because there are too many. I think we've done something to reduce that, or we're in the process of. I can't remember where we're at right now, but the goal is to drop them down. One of the places that we have to keep some of them in is on our mental health and substance abuse block grants, because the feds require us to do that. But for state money, I don't know why we do it. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Because if you're billing an ED service, you would assume it's somebody who's got
Yeah.
this.
Exactly.
Wow.
I think the idea of the individual budget is fantastic, and had a conversation with someone, I think his initials are Dave Richard, one time, and he was explaining to me that, like my son, who needs services, like behavioral services provided, but doesn't really need the medical side of it, that, I guess my question is this what you're talking about? Could that not be shared? He really doesn't need the medical side of it right now, thank goodness. Could that be shared? Is that what you're talking about with the individual budget?
It would be really nice in Medicaid if we could actually not do that, but right now Medicaid doesn't allow you not to link both. So you get the Medicaid card and the
What about with state-funded services?
state funded services. There is no additional part of that has to happen. So that's part, you wouldn't have to do that. The problem with state funded services is just such a lack of it. I mean, there isn't any, right? I mean, there isn't any new money coming through that side. What I would say to you is, and this is one thing in the governor's budget that we asked them to put in as a provision, and it's in the legislative, that require us to come back to the General Assembly and make recommendations on whether we would be better, whether it would be a good idea for us to have something called the supports waiver. And what we have in there describes it at $20,000 as the cap on that waiver. And the rationale behind that is that there are a lot of people that receive state-funded services that are Medicaid eligible, that probably would be eligible for a waiver. But because the comprehensive waiver can be so expensive, that we have no ability to make that transition. So in a perfect world, you could go in and say, so how many people right now in Smoky with IDD are receiving services that are pure state money that would be eligible for a waiver and make that determination, and would create a waiver form and just use the federal money? Well, feds will say no to that, because they'll figure out that shall make. But they would not say no to a state coming in and saying, we'd like to do this support waiver because we think there are a lot of people who have minimal, I don't want to say minimal needs, but that right now don't have a need for really expensive services. And we could address a lot of the waitlist issue. And one of the byproducts of that might be that people that currently are receiving state services would then receive Medicaid services, which would allow us to reinvest that state money into something else. That's the thought process behind it. We're struggling with, if we do individual budgets, in this comprehensive waiver, does that accomplish the same thing? We're not sure, and I think that's the analysis that we have to do, and we'd like to hear from them, because, we do another waiver, it's gonna be more burden on the LMEMCO to manage that, but it may help us in terms of utilizing federal money rather than state money for a lot of services. Now, on just the pure individual budget side, the part that I think is the most important of that is that, Katie, you know what he needs, right? So if you know what the dollar amount is, then you would have that, and you can make a decision about how you want to serve the services. So one of the things that we hear from people a lot is that they struggle between whether it's personal care, whether it's habilitative, or this stuff. Well, we might could get rid of that conversation. Not that we'd have to document those things for the feds about what we're doing, but the real issue that people fight about, it's not so much whether it's personal care or habilitation. What they fight about is how much money you're paid so you can hire somebody that's high quality to come in your home. That's really what the fight's about. It's not so much about HIP or personal care. So we have some blended ability to do that, and if you could choose to say, well, I have enough money to get 5 hours a day of services if I pay $10, but if I just say I want 4 and I can pay $12.50, I'll get a much better worker, and that's not the right word, I get somebody I can trust and that'll be there longer, then that seems like a pretty good idea. So I think that's the potential that individual budget has for us to think about it, if we do it right. Because some states have done it, and their services look exactly like they've always looked. They haven't really changed much, and we can't do that. That's not what we want to do.
And then to have an individual budget for each person, that's going to be an arduous task.
Yeah.
So I heard this, that some of the members of our General Assembly I think the words were buyer's remorse with the lack of case management that the non-existence of case management anymore. So it would require, with an individual budget, to have somebody such as a case manager, whatever it be called.
I think we hear this across the state. So let's get it out on the table. That when case management no longer existed, there's something missing. So care coordination does its role. There are other things that seem to be missing. What I'll tell you is that we can't go back to water and case management. We won't, we can't. But there is something, and I think we can figure it out. What is it that's missing? One conversation we had is that, so if you have X amount of money and you wanted to purchase the time of somebody to write a person-centered plan that isn't an individual support plan, but it's really about big-time life goals, and you don't have to write it on our format and all that other junk to really do that. Well, maybe that's something you want, because it might change the way you got it. Or if you want to have somebody that can really help navigate the complexity of what our systems look like, that isn't at that high level of care coordinator, then that might make sense to do it. But there are different things we can do. We have some service definitions that allow it to happen, but I don't think they go to the right place. So that's part of what we've heard everywhere in the state. And, again, in our position is we're not going to lie to you. We're not going to bring case management back. We're not going to do that. But there is something that we have to think about. And so that's part of this conversation. Let me go to people I haven't listened.
Okay. Richard, I am a CFO of Small Miracle Incorporated. I'm also the father of a 22-year-old autistic son. So I can speak on both sides of the issue here. Now, before there were MCOs, there were LMEs. Before there were LMEs, they were called counties. But for all of this, we had to do cost reports that are used to set the reimbursement rates. Okay? It makes perfectly good sense. This is how much I had to spend to provide these services. The state looked at it, they put it through their matrix, and they said, okay, this is the new reimbursement rate. Okay? Historically speaking, and I started checking around some people, that over that period of time, the standard rate of return, if you want to call it profit margin, whatever you want to call it, was about 10%. They consider that to be if you had a well-run company that did smart things, that you would have about a 10% rate of return on your investment. Okay, from a company's point of view.
Who told you this?
It's historical. Historical with my company. Okay, when we went to the MCOs.
If I were you, I wouldn't go too far down that path, talking about 10% profit.
No, because you took it all the way. You took it all the way. Profit margin provided for things like capital improvement of the company, raises for deserving individuals, expanding business opportunities, and an emergency expense fund that you had to have set aside for those rainy days, just like the state is required to do. However, over the last 5 years, we've taken about a 7.5% rate cut across the board. Since then, and the NCOs took over, there has not been one cost report required. So my question is, if they don't require a cost report, they've never done a cost report, how can they fairly set a reimbursement rate for companies?
So, you want the honest answer?
Sure. No, I'd like to be a state bureaucrat, but tell me the truth.
So here's the answer. One is that if, and I'll say this again, is that if you get a 10% profit margin, not 10% average, 10% profit margin, then somebody will screw up royalty. Because you should never do 10%. So just take that, that's real. Hospitals right now will tell you that they're running margins at about 1% to 2.5%.
Their volume is much higher than mine.
It's all fine. What I'm saying is that it's just, this is my being honest. I think you have to be real cautious about where you're going with that argument. Right now, most LME MCOs are using rates set by Medicaid already. They're using historical rates that have been there. They haven't changed that. They were rate set as they went forward. Over the course of the time, LME MCOs will do their own rate setting. And that's what we want to see them do. We're hoping that the process won't be something that's radical. We know already that some rates go up. You're paying certain services higher rates, and they need to do that. Some will pay different rates as we're going forward. But CMS will require that there's a process that they use to get that rate setting, because that's part of the methodology they have to do. Now, it may not be the methodology that got you 10%, but there will be some requirement that there is something that if they show that rate setting, that it meets the CMS rules. So there will be that in that process. I will say, I'll go on the other side of this, is that we can't, they can't, the state can't continue to drive down rates on providers and expect to have any kind of quality service. I don't think that's what they're thinking. Now, part of what I'll say is that we've got to do our thing, because we can't drive their rates down. If we drive their rates down to a level where they can't be flexible enough to provide the kind of service dollars that you need to run your business, then they're in the same position. So it is a two-edged sword. We've got to make sure we do our job and our rate setting with them. And they've got to do their job and rate setting with you. Now, I think that we'll get to the right place. Never going back to the 10% profit. But you might go back to where you can get a reasonable return on the dollars, you can reinvest in the company, and do the right thing. And that's what we want to get done. I know you can't run a business as a losing money constantly. You have to have a margin to survive. MCOs have to have a margin to survive too. So we've got to get that right. But I'm not so sure I worry about the cost report right now. I worry about their rate setting process. Now, one thing they'll tell you is that.
Wait a minute, how can they set their rates if they don't know?
Well, they'll know.
I mean, they're just like.
I guess part of what I'm thinking is I don't. So let me argue this back to you. As the legislature passed a bill that said we have to go back to requiring cost reports from residential providers. I don't know if you saw that. That was a bill that came out, and that was really related a lot to anybody that receives special assistance. So that provider had to do it. The lobby from provider organizations was absolutely strong as I've ever seen, asking us not to implement what the law said. Now, somewhere in between, there's got to be that issue. So they started asking the cost reports, which they will at some point, how do you justify your rates? And I suspect that's going to be looked at as this more administrative burden to throw on top of it. Now, I think if we go to a system where we provide funding for individuals based upon their individual need, based upon their circumstance, and you can decide whether or not you're going to serve somebody based upon what that budget is. And I think that's going to be the model we're headed to, where you're going to wind up doing that. But I'm not so sure you want to go back to the stage where we provide these really detailed cost reports to the state and to LMEs. At least that's what people told us when backed off of it. We found a way, especially with the smaller providers, with 6 beds or less, so people wouldn't have to do it. And it seemed to make a lot of people happy. So, that's just my opinion, so. Yes, sir.
What I see a lot is a lack of support for our IDD population that have significant behavioral issues in the community. And there seems to be no in the middle or transitional housing or assistance. And really, the hospitals aren't designed or set up for folks with IDD with behavioral issues, and that folks end up in the emergency room, in the emergency department for days and days. So the only other place is sending them into long-term institutional care or back home. So they're either back home and chemically restrained or over-medicated, or they're sent to the institutional setting for a given period of time, baseline, sent home within weeks.
Absolutely right.
So there's no room for folks with behavioral needs.
I think what you said is really valuable. We've heard it in different ways in several places, but what we know is one of those things that is really lacking in our system. And it's different in some areas. People are trying to do different things. Is that the crisis ability to deal with people in crisis, one, and then two, to provide the actual support to keep people out of crisis. What we absolutely hear from the hospitals, and it's anecdotal at this time, but I think we're collecting that information, is that the hardest people we get in most departments are those people that have a co-occurring intellectual disability. And that is the one. So if you think about one of the big issues that drive us right now, is how do we reduce that length of stay in emergency departments, people with mental illness, or we've got a whole bunch of people with IBD in there that's part of that real issue. So we've got to address it. Really look for some very specific recommendations from you about what that looks like.
Can I ask him a question?
Sure.
I don't want to answer, but I'll ask.
Yeah.
How do you, well, would you describe your experience with NC Star?
Well, NC Start.
Maybe if you want to explain that.
Sure. Two things with NC Start is, they're trying to start it up for kids, which is great.
It's hard to hear you over here.
Just talk louder.
Oh, sure. It would be great to see it expanded for kids, but I also found that NC Start, as far as residential, the residential capacity isn't there, and it's not built for significant behavioral issues. And that's what we really need. And what I really think is the AFL model, they don't have enough training for significant behavioral issues. And what I'd love to see is more of a therapeutic foster care type of model implemented for folks with IBD that can transition either to stop them from going to an institution or to step down out of an institution before they come home so they have better structure.
I think we value your sort of feedback on it. I think Brian's question about START was really important too, because it is one of the questions. You know, when we started START, we sort of did it at a dollar amount that was less than recommended by the process that we did it. So we stayed constant. So we're trying to figure out how best to really deal with that. I know you guys have put some more money into it. It's a great thing to do, but there's something else that's there. I mean, actually think there's a role that we have some people at our state facilities that are pretty smart about things, but we don't get a chance to even have those as a part of the community anymore because of the way the system works. So we're trying to figure out how to integrate all that together makes some sense, and I think we really want to talk more about that because it is one of the biggest issues we hear about. But we will.
On the other end, George talked about, when they come out of school, but we've got individuals that there's nothing for retirement age. Dementia is happening, we see in earlier and earlier in our IDD. We have developed a program that absorbs those individuals, and along with working with ARP to maintain them, to keep them in their home environment and to give them the day support that they need. But there's no funding for that. And families, they need support for their loved one. And that's another, for an example, let me give you how we're doing the whole person. One individual went through the services, got a job out in the community,
now back in the retirement end of our facility, and actually working with the facility too, and she's functioning in an environment and flourishing. So, is there plans for individuals from, as he mentioned, anywhere from birth, to retirement?
Part of, so I'm assuming this individual did not have a waiver slot, right? So, what we know, and this is one of those kind of weird things that's happened too, is that we have a bunch of people in our system whose families, I think, they were pioneers, right? Doing a lot of stuff in the community, went to programs like yours and other places and started. Never asked for that waiver slot because they felt comfortable in the service they were getting. But as they've aged and they need more support, we really don't have this revenue stream to support that. Again, I think there is a way for us to begin to think about, because I'll make one or more assumption is that she probably does have Medicaid or health insurance, maybe not correct, but that might, odds are she would, and maybe very well be eligible for innovations waiver slot or something else, but we've never done it because we've always relied upon that state-funded appropriation to do that. We've got to get past that. We've got to figure out how to use that Medicaid funds to help support that. So those people that aren't Medicaid eligible will have those state dollars available for them. And so the answer is we don't have a specific plan. I think the best answer is that we get the system right-sized, that we ought to have people age in place. And they ought to be able to age where they need to age. So if it's residential, they ought not be forced to leave a residential setting because they've gotten older. We need to have the right way to support them there. And if it's in vocational, like you guys have done that kind of work for them, there has to be a way for them to retire around the friends that they've made and want to be around. It is not an easy fix, but I think it's important for us to have higher needs and think about it.
And sometimes they don't want to go to work
Yes.
anymore. They
Sure.
want to stay home.
Absolutely.
And they can't do that either. And they're 70, almost 80
Yeah.
years old, and they're forced to get up and go to work every day.
Because that's the only service available. Right?
Exactly. So we have changed our services to meet that need. Another thing, and this is just a pet peeve of me, is that when we look at service definitions, and I understand we have to have them, that's all it is, but I don't like being lumped in with everybody else. I would hope that when decisions are made as to services and what's good in the different communities and what's working and how it works, that it wouldn't be just like ADVP is just like this horrible word, it's awful. Well, with ADVP at HBO, they get a lot more, and they're working and making more than they could out in the community. So, but yet the waiver and so forth keeps us, you've got to keep moving them because they can only make so much. So the system really hurts our people in some ways.
And I'll tell you, one of the issues around the Medicaid is a federal issue. In terms of how much money you can make. It's not something that we're going to change. It is something that we ought to be yelling at our federal legislators about, thinking about changing, because it really disincentives folks going to work. There's a complicating factor that's coming, as you know, the home and community-based standard rules that are coming out of that have come, and they'll give us guidance around vocational programs, but we haven't seen that guidance yet. And that is of anything on the horizon that I'm most worried about, that's one of the things that's at the top. Because we have that kindred spirit on service definitions. I think that we are way too prescriptive, way too prescriptive. We created service definitions, frankly, in the fee-for-service world to manage costs. And most of what we do in service definitions, I don't know how anybody stays legal because they are so complex and so difficult. And we're asking people who are high school graduates to run these service definitions and do these, and I'm not sure why we do that. But I think, and this is again the goal of what we're trying to go, overnight, we get to a system that we can be predictable, more individualized budgets for people, we can reduce that complexity of those service definitions.
That was
Yes.
that
was your hand.
My issue too. It's so nitpicky, like for in-home skill building, it has to end or start or end in the home. Well, if you've got a parent that's in the hospital or out of state, and clients are respite. They don't have access to their home. And so, what do you do?
I mean, again, I think it's
I mean,
well.
are we gonna have to pay back in that situation if? we
Well,
had to do that?
intentioned, how we wrote them, I think whenever you get so prescriptive, you wind up not being able to account for individual circumstances. And what we want to do is, if you really believe in person-centered, then you're less prescriptive. Now, there are some things you have to do. You have to put minimum standards, and those are the things that we want to have in service definition, things that you can measure against. If we continue to shift to a more outcome-based system, then I think we can be less prescriptive. And that's really what our goal would be. Again, I'd like to see a whole lot less, because I don't know if we need all the ones that we have, if you have individual budgets.
It certainly has put us providers in a fix.
Haven't been on the other side, I absolutely know, and again, I think for us to believe that people aren't violating those service definitions right this moment, somewhere in Waynesville, we're silly. Because it's happening because by accident, somebody is, and the good people, they violate.
Individual budgets and the SIS evals, which we are going through and going through and going through. The relationship between the two?
There is a relationship, and what I believe, and I think what our team believes, is that you can't be just a SIS. This is a good tool. This is a good tool to determine need. It doesn't determine circumstances, it determines need. It is part of, and it will be a big part of how we'll figure out budgets, but there have to be other things that tie to that. So part of it is the planning process should help instruct. History should help, but the circumstances of whether somebody's in a residential setting, whether they're living at home with an intact family, that's the right way to say it, two-person family, two parents, or one parent, that should help instruct us. What's the availability of other resources that people use? So it can't just be the SIS, but the SIS is a great starting point, and that's where we're at.
So your level system, because that's what we kept hearing with the system assessments, was that we're going to develop a level system.
We'll drive an individual budget.
To drive individual budget.
So one of the things that,
Level 1 is going to be this, level 2 is going to be that.
well, that's not how we would do it. So certainly where you fall on assist will be an instructive part of what goes on, and that will be a piece of it, and we'll drive a lot of it. So you got 10 different budget bands that you could do in. And you do the assist assessment, and X things exist out of that. That might instruct you that probably ought to be in, 3 or 4, but then you get some other things engaged in that conversation. Well, maybe that band, I'm using 3 or 4 band, not numbers, well, maybe it really is a 5, because there are other things that come into that play. I think that's how we want to design the system, so that's what happens. It's not based upon, so your system X, this is exactly what you get, because that is not, well, I think any state that's done that recognizes that's not the way to do it. There have to be other things that tie to it, and it's not fair and equitable. That's the other part. Now, we will get to a point where we'll say, this is enough, and this is where people are. And there will be, I think, there'll be arguments about that. There'll be people that don't feel right about it. So what we have to do is make sure there's a process by which you can go through, where is a consideration, and we'll call it, but there's some process that we do that. And that's got to be something where people feel that it's fair. Now, at some point, it ends. And when it ends, this is what the number is, and we have to live with it. Now, I will say is that, as long as it's a fair, equitable process, that everybody understands what the rules are as we go forward, we go through that process, recognizing what the goal is. The goal is that we create a sustainable system. Had somebody at a meeting recently sort of rattled off about 10 different things that we have to do. And I talked to her later and said, the 10 things you described, if we did it today, would cost about 30% more in our current innovation budget. That means that we'd be about $600 million to $700 million, which, one, nobody would give us that money. Understand that. But even if they did, what that would mean is that nobody ever, again, would get additional labor service. Because we're going to have money to do. So I'll tell you, this isn't a budget exercise, but it is a process to create something that is predictable for us to go forward, so we can have investment. Because no matter who's in power, who's elected, we're not gonna have $300 million drop in a lap. It's not gonna happen. So we have to have some way to manage that. But it has to be fair, it has to be equitable, and people have to trust it. So there's several other hands that went back. No.
Yes, you do. Hey, Dave.
This is gonna be short.
Welcome to West North Carolina. First, when can we have any idea when the SIS, how it's going to be used? Because we've been hearing about it going to be used, but they haven't really come out with any idea of when. Is there any?
I'll tell you that probably, one of the things that we are arranging with the stakeholder group is a conversation with the folks that are the scientists, if you will, about how to arrange budgets. And so we're going to have that conversation. I don't, we haven't scheduled the time yet. I don't know if we're here.
Tomorrow?
No, we had that, oh, we had the call, so it's coming up tomorrow. So we'll have that, man, I should know better.
So by the end of the year, we should be
Oh,
here.
no, I think so. I think what we want to do is we want to go through a logical process. And again, we're using the stakeholder group as your surrogate, if you will, on the day-to-day stuff that we do, because we want other people to look at it. And then, once we have some of those conversations, we'll go to the full stakeholder group in a public meeting and say, here's what we think, get that feedback, and you'll have a shot at it.
And the last question I have here.
Come on, really?
Yeah, I'll just ask you two.
This is good.
On the clinical part, when we talk about person-centered planning, that's a great concept. The budget's a great concept. That's all person stuff. But how is the clinical piece going to play into this? Because right now, that's really not part of the team, but yet they seem to be making a lot of decisions. Is that going to still be a major role in the future? The clinical piece, the people that, the managed care individuals.
Okay, so the UR clinical side
Yes,
of it.
yes, the UR piece.
And this is another thing that we have to figure out. So I don't know the answer.
Okay.
But if you have a system that's designed upon a solid assessment, the other information coming in on the front end, right? We do that work. And that system is something that we agree on. When I'm doing that stuff. And when I say that we agree on, it doesn't mean that everybody in the state's going to agree on it, obviously. We'll have disagreements. But collectively, it's a system we decide to go forward with. Then in some respects, the back end stuff that we do becomes less important, right? Because UR is about how do you look at what the clinical needs of a person are, assign that for what you're paying money for. If you add all of that stuff on the front end, then the back end UR stuff becomes less complicated. It becomes a different function. So I'm not so sure. I think we solved some of those issues that people are concerned about by heading in this direction. Not all, but some of them. So exactly what that looks like, we're working with our MCO partners to kind of talk that through in terms of what the future looks like. But it will necessarily change because it's a new system. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I get to see everything from, as an uncle, a provider, thank God I'm not the CAP coordinator anymore, haven't anybody pissed at me. I think all this gives you a chance, people who are bright enough will still be able to play the game and get as much as they want, so I think you gotta be careful.
Okay, that's good.
For the people, I know you say case management's gone. The reality is I talk to people weekly, sometimes a month, who have case management, they're not lucky, they don't have that Ferrari, they don't have innovations. They used to have a Yugo, now they got nothing, and they're calling at Western Highlands, they had a kick coordinator, luckily, now they don't even have that. So I think you need to find a way, either if it's not gonna be case management or something similar, then that care coordination is made available to everybody with IDD. So they know what's happening, they know they're on the registry, they know that there's B3 services. There's gotta be a way, because they're out there, they got autism. Some of them can't get other stuff, and I report them that way. So those people have really been lost, and that's wrong.
Yeah, I think that's, we've heard similar things across the board. So, if you're on innovations waiver, some people are unhappy with their care coordinator, but basically, care coordination works, it does well during a process. If you don't have innovations waiver, there's not the resources to have the kind of robust thing that people are looking for. Is there something else that would make sense? I think that's a great advice. If you've got 10,000 people on a waiting list and maybe 5,000 are getting state services or some other number, what are those other 5,000 people doing? What
They've been harmless. I mean, they've been harmless.
That's a very strong, and that's a.
The other thing people need to know is that there is other stuff in North Carolina. People with IDD can qualify for Cap C, it's available in the counties with a wait list. They can't qualify for Cap EA, there are wait lists. But at 18, you can get on the wait list. I think Buncombe County's 3 months, Madison County's 4 years, still shorter than this. The state personal care services, there is stuff, it may not meet all the needs, but a lot of the IDD folks will fit into this other Medicaid stuff. And they still can stay on the wait list. And 10 years from now, make it a stop. So,
That's fair.
it's going to really bounce out of behavior.
Backing up. Follow. Oh, I'm sorry. So you're just taking pictures today, huh?
That's all right. Thank you, Dave. I got two different issues. The biggest one, well, they're not the biggest one, both of them big. For 27 years, I've helped kids with special needs in school. And I'm hearing all kinds of conversation here, but it's not about prevention. It's about the end result of what you haven't done. And I think to capitalize on what you need to go forward with is to some way to get DPI, the legislators, talking together to make sure that the school overall is involved in this process somewhere, because what's happening, the school is responsible for guidelines of special needs, but their interpretation of what we're looking at as diagnosis, what the doctor says, two different things. Then you get into all kinds of paperwork. The kids fail, they don't get services, then they end up in DSS or juvenile court, and then they end up on the street homeless. So really, prevention is not even in the picture here, which it should be, because you've got school counselors, you've got school social workers, you've got teachers that's supposed to be responsible on how to work with these children. And why the focus isn't on the prevention, I don't understand, because when you focus on the budget and focus on the emergency room, hospitals, you're on the wrong end. You might be dealing with that, and that's good. We know that happens. But the thing that I've heard from psychiatrists, doctors, and therapists at the hospital is they just keep coming back. And that's true. Keep repeating. So I think that the focus needs to be on the school, and it needs to be young teachers don't even have staff development to even handle a kid with a learning disabled kid, much less developmental disability or behavior. So you're seeing the result of these things that they're talking about on the other end because they're not there. So I think that is a focus. The other thing is Obamacare. Obamacare is fixing to screw us all, because what's going to happen, these hours are going to be cut and you ain't going to find employers to employ people. So all this nice stuff that you're talking about putting together to make people happy to get a budget, forget it. You ain't going to have people to work your budget. You're just going to have money and you ain't going to have nothing else. And then you're going to have the hospitals and everything else full. So in the end, you've defeated the purpose by the federal laws trumping the state. So I think we need to be talking about two issues. That's the federal end, on both of them, special education on the federal end and Obama on the federal end. I think those two driving forces that's already created big problems.
I couldn't agree with you more about the front end stuff and working with schools. We are doing a better job in Raleigh at the very least of trying to work with DPI on certain issues. But that's a big lift because they got a lot of things that they're trying to do too. But clearly we've got to do a better job in schools. And frankly, in early intervention, we've got to collaborate better. We might have great collaboration here, I'm not sure, but we've heard in several places that sometimes the interactions between the CDSA system and the LME-MCO system doesn't work very well. And that is sort of it's not any blame on any one side, it just is, and we've got to deal with that. What you mentioned about the Affordable Care Act, I'm going to try to be non-political. Affordable Care Act issue is that employer mandate, right, that comes in place on January 1st, which has enormously in our system to create disruption because of people that currently may not receive benefits, will have to get benefits. I don't think it's been contemplated about what that impact will have. And there hasn't been any new money coming down from the feds in terms of to add to Medicaid rates or even, so one of the places where you might talk to some of your federal legislators is that, is there something you can do to deal with that issue going forward? Is there another way to address that? But it is going to be an issue in North Carolina.
I would hope that the DPI, the education end of it, I hope it's not a trickle-down thing. It takes another 20 years to get here. And the federal level, they've never funded special education at the level they should. So I think that needs to be talked about at the state legislatures to the federal people. Because they've got people they can talk to that gets there quicker than we can. But I've been to these meetings and school meetings, and it's always a blame game. I think the MCOs need to get off their tail, including Smokey, because they're lawyers. They ought to know the federal law, and they should, but they don't seem to get it. And I think that they can push the envelope at the local level and get it back to the state level. Because if MCOs don't get engaged and get the schools involved to a point that they can, they ain't ever going to get no lobby to go to Raleigh, except for teacher pay. I mean, you can get teacher pay, go to Raleigh. But for the kids, who's suffering? The kids. I'm tired of seeing adults take priority.
I think what we'll say is I think there's no question across the state we can do a better job at all of that collaboration coordination. And it's complex. There are a lot of issues that we have to address in it, but I do appreciate you bringing them up in here because it forces us to pay attention to them.
I'll be back.
Maybe a school board member that wants to talk. I don't know. So.
Is there still a chance that North Carolina will take the Medicaid expansion?
No. Really. So I will just say what we're doing and what I can tell you, because that is a decision that the governor and the legislature will make. But Secretary Bosch has, I think, been real public about it, that our responsibility is to make sure that we are competent to manage if the decision is made to expand Medicaid. And that we're working through that process, we're making sure that we have the right information to the governor about what that means and what it looks like. I think we will be. I think one of her responses has been when asked that question, it's been soon, and I think that soon continues to get closer. But that is, it's a decision that the governor and the legislature will make. I will say, I think you've probably heard the governor, and you've heard other people say that it's not off the table, and that there's a more active conversation about that. But thanks a lot for asking that. I thought you were a friend.
I have two questions. One, has anyone talked about AFLs ever getting respite though?
Oh, yeah. It's been amazing how these things work. There are some meetings where one thing gets talked about a lot, and there was like 5 or 6 of them that they got talked about a lot, and fell off the cliff in some other ways. I don't know why. But yes, and I think what we know is that there's going to be some way in which that we allow for that. Somebody put it, the best way to put it is that it's not only respite for the provider, and understand that, but for the individual that they're providing service, there's also a little bit of a respite need there. And that was a really clever way of thinking about it. So yes, it's on there, and we're talking about it. We don't have to say we have an answer. I don't know, but I think we know it has to be addressed.
And then the second question, I'm assuming someone's talked about is backup staffing. I get that people need it, but the whole monotonous,
Could you brought it up again?
Do you realize, I'm sorry,
Could you brought it up again? It's on the list. It's on several other pages that we have elsewhere. So yeah.
it's just especially like a day program, we have a day program, I'm sure HBO has to deal with. If someone doesn't come, we have to say why, fine. It's not because we aren't staffing, it's because maybe they chose not to come that day. But we're accounting for that. Because we really do have time for people, things that don't meet those things in the innovation manual, and it's just difficult. I get that people need staffing.
No, I understand.
But there's also, it's a little ridiculous, some of it.
by doing not the backup staffing, it's for
So here's what I'll guarantee you, is that in our process, we'll listen to everything, we'll try to do everything right when we get there, but I guarantee you, we'll do something that has unintended consequence, that we won't want, because it's just complicated. I think what we know, and I think it's a great way to put it, is that what we're finding is there are several decisions we'll make past that have unintended consequences. We've got to figure out what they are, and that's, we've heard it from a lot of places, and we have to find it.
Along those same lines as the schedules that they have for the innovations, because, you know, if they close down the Music Works for the 2 months for the summer, and you're getting community networking for that, then you've got to, like, you've got to document they're not getting it. And again, the paperwork on the queues, it's just, obviously they're not getting it, the place is closed, but they'll get it when it starts back up again. Or a class at school for college, it's not offered this semester, so we change it, but now we gotta change the whole schedule and resubmit it, and
So let me tell you what I
like
just heard.
person-centered
What I heard
stuff would
was,
be nice.
boy, it'd be really great if we had an individual budget with lots of flexibility inside of it. That's what I heard.
Can you just elaborate on what backup staffing means?
Well, I think it's a requirement that it has to have a backup staff. If you're having staff come in, you have to identify who that staff is, right? In that process.
So when innovations waiver, if a staff doesn't show up, there has to be a backup staff.
But then if the backup staff is not available or whatever, there's a bunch of different reasons you have to do all this paperwork. And what you do is online with Smoky, but you have to do one form online for each service. So if you have a flu season where you've got 4 workers called out this morning, and each of you don't have backup staff because they've got the flu too, you've got to do, 2 or 3 or 4 forms for each of those individuals. That ties up the queue for hours and hours and hours instead of finding more backup staff and going out, seeing this individual and doing some things, paperwork.
So what I'd say at the beginning is that we have system design problems.
Yes.
And often, again, I will tell you, when I was on the other side, I would blame the LMU and there's system design problems that probably aren't their fault because they're having to manage what we've said in a way that we have to do. Lots of things, great intention, right? But what we don't do sometimes, we think about what the implications are. That's what you're saying. So we want backup staff. We don't want people not to be without staff. But if you want to spend so much time doing the work around how to report what happens to backup staff, you probably don't have time to get the backup staff.
Right, and again, if agencies do a bad job of staffing,
Oh, yeah.
they're gonna go out of business
Well, and
because somebody else is supposed to staff.
When you think about
As it
outcomes,
should
right?
be.
So if the agency's doing such a lousy job at staffing, then probably people won't choose them anymore.
Exactly.
That's what it creates in that time. I recall I talking a lot, and one of the bizarre things when I taught at school was that if you need a substitute, you had to find a substitute. So if I was deathly ill at home, and I couldn't get up, I had to call around to this list of people to find a substitute. Well, by the time I started doing that, I was like, well, I'm just going to go in, because I'm better off going. But it's sort of that sense of it, that you create these really unintended consequences that have people doing that. Right, it's exactly right. Yeah. Yes.
Dave, appreciate you and your staff coming west of Asheville. It's a big.
How about that, huh?
Yeah.
We really appreciate that. The other thing, sad that there's some system design flaws. It pains me to make a public apology to Brian Ingram, because every time I say, Brian, we've got problems, he says, talk to Dave, because it's a system design flaw.
That's right, you should.
But the system design flaw that I really wanted to ask about is just the discrepancy between those who have innovation slots and those who don't. And the Smoky Mountain Provider Network Council has set this as a goal for this coming year, is to look at, as a provider community, what can we do to help support those who don't have slots? There's limited to no funding, but we're talking about great things like crisis services, which now are being taken out of the ED. We're talking about integrated care where there's not money. We're talking about a population that really clogs up the ED because there's not expertise there. So really, what can we do? What is your suggestion of what we can do to help build a system while these design flaws are being worked out?
Well, one, do exactly what you did, is keep raising that point, that this waiting list stuff is not there. I think the idea, the network council and that Smokey's doing that is wonderful, we should do. push us to make the changes we should be making right now. So one of the, in House Bill 916, which I don't know what it's really called anymore, but the bill that's set up for the managed care organizations, there's language in it that says that in the innovation way, it should be aggregate funding, which the meaning of that is that if they save money, you ought to have more slots. The fact that they can't do that is just absurd. I mean, that is, it sort of violates everything about what you would do in managed care. So with one easy solution, wouldn't fix the waiting list, but it would begin to get them in a different place. I think helping us figure out whether or not doing a support waiver or some other mechanism in which we can provide services to people that don't have significant needs, using Medicaid money so we can reinvest the state dollars elsewhere is one of those big deals. You got to figure that out because, you know, if you think of, I don't know what the number is, but you hear different numbers of folks, but suppose that 60 to 70% of the people on a waiting list are Medicaid eligible. And if that, maybe 50% of them would be eligible for innovations or some other Medicaid service, we're just wasting money. I mean, it's just dumb. We need to change that. So, because that's not Medicaid expansion, that's using Medicaid the right way. It's using that federal dollar first. So push us hard on those things. And then, if you think of stuff, you know, just anything that y'all can think of that makes sense for us to try, we want to try. I think one of the things that we can do so much better is to eliminate some of the regulatory burden. I mean, if we do that, you might have a little bit more ability to provide services to people that just need a little bit of support under your current budget. But you know, we're killing people with regulatory burden. Is that fair?
That is, so right now, what would be your suggestion to the network council of what we can do to take action starting tomorrow that can help create change?
Why don't you tell us, Brian, us, 5 things that we could do to reduce your cost. You know, targeted things that we can reduce, understanding that we can only do it if it's legal, you know, and that it doesn't, just 5 very targeted things. Say, do these things, reduce our costs, I could serve somebody, you know, at least provide some support to somebody. We hear a lot of, say this, and this is not a criticism of anybody. We hear a lot of issues, and that's really what we want to do. We don't get as much tangible, targeted, this is what we do. And I think, you know, we are, you know, our administration is one that believes in regulatory reform. That's what we want to do. And we, again, I am terribly disappointed that we have not made more progress on that in the HHS for behavioral health and IDD. We've got to. Oh, you said 2 questions, you're done. I'm sorry.
I just thought of another. If a provider that is trying to provide services and has people that are eligible for those services and can get the funding, but then can't get the contract, how would you recommend that they try? Because they've tried 3 times and they've been rejected all 3 times.
So it's a complicated story.
Is there a provider group, is that the way they need to go to try to?
I think that's probably a worthwhile thing to have the conversation. I think, so the in managed care.
They are in managed care, they've tried to get state funds, and they've tried several times to put a contract, they even have a population identified and people with services if they could provide it, or people that would be eligible, but yet can't get any way forward on it.
And it is different in every LMEMCO about how they manage provider networks. And frankly, that's their responsibility. So it is a issue. I do think, and we've had this conversation with the CEOs, is that because we have exclusive franchises, that there's a higher degree of responsibility to make sure that that is a fair and equitable process too. But at the end of the day, they have a fixed amount of money, and they have to manage that money. So the state can't take that responsibility of managing the provider network away from them. We can encourage, we can continue to have a dialogue about how do you make sure that it's transparent, that it works the right way, that we have some consistency across the state. And I think that's probably we're going to write down. Okay. That's your suggestion.
Yeah, there's really, they don't have a reason other than the first time it was because there was not enough funds. Then they found out there was funds. And now they've been told that it's because there's enough providers providing the service. And they actually have identified people who would be better and healthier, and they've identified a population, hoping that would actually help them in their argument. But I'll tell them to go talk to the provider network, because that'll give them
That's
a way
good,
to
because
talk
he's
to.
here, make sure you know.
Okay.
Are you open to new service definitions?
As long as they're not really prescriptive.
Oh, yeah. That work.
I mean,
Is that something that can be submitted?
no, I think a couple things that we encourage, so here's another one of our confessions, is that in state money, state services, that LMNCOs can submit to us alternative service definitions anytime they want, right? So it could be unique to the LMNCO. Little problem is that we have to approve it. And for a long time, our process to approve them would encourage you never to submit them. So we're changing that. And so, again, my philosophy is that you got a service definition work and you want to pay for it, why do we care? Frankly, give us a service definition. Our answer should be yes, unless there's something that is so, that we think you're going to kill somebody because of it, but otherwise, yeah. So I would work with these guys, and if there's something that makes sense to do that's going to help, anybody do that? Yeah.
I think Jerry brought up the point of prevention. And one of the things that I think is a little bit backwards with the way the innovation data works. And one thing is setting aside maybe for duly diagnosed or autism-specific services so that we can get services to children when they're young so that they're less expensive on the system later on. And I think if you invest that money with 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, and instead of being on the wait list for 5, 6, 7 years being a teenager before you're off the wait list, that you would actually find it cheaper.
It's interesting, because one of the things that, personally, I think is a sport waiver in many ways is designed for that, except for, what we wound up having to submit. The reason for this is something that talks about just adults. And the reason for that is because the adults would have been already on Medicaid. And if you do it for children, and you add the Medicaid, if they're not Medicaid eligible to begin with, the healthcare side of that. Now, that's not a reason not to do it. It was a way to get people convinced that we should try it, right? But I think a lot of states do that. There's a targeted dollar amount that is much less for children as they go on, but if you want to get that service to them, it is already invention. Great suggestion.
Dave, I'd like to ask a question on organization. I'll use the organizational chart as a framework, but these pigeonhole meetings we have for different topics, are there any way that you have something like an organizational chart, that kind of gives a description of what yins are doing overall, where you can identify what actually is being done from a kid that's come out of the hospital with a diagnosis and how you work up the line? Because I have no idea who to contact about this, or this, or this, but we're talking about the tail end of something right now, but I have nowhere to go here and up the line. So do you have anything that would be descriptive?
So we've had a couple of meetings where people have said this, and they've suggested that if you go on our website, it is absolutely useless. Because you can't find anything like that, and they're right.
A pea in the ocean.
You can't. So we've responded that our website may not be as customer friendly as it should be. Great suggestion. One of the things that we know, and I think, and I haven't looked at Smokey's website. So I don't know what it's like.
It's just as bad.
Well, so we've all got one. But a part of the, and again, we own it, is that, and I don't know if you've ever tried to design a website that's easy. That's almost impossible to do, but that's what we have to do. Again, I think part of the way to gain trust in the system is that people understand everything. So people know what the rules are. They know what the limitations are. People tend to trust those systems better. Even if they don't like it, they tend to trust it better. And so we've got a big job in front of us, is to try to do exactly as you described, is to get clarity so that most people are using websites now, so that people can go someplace and understand what they're into. Even as simple as some of the acronyms that we have, is people understanding what we're talking about, right? But no, So, how's that answer? We do not have it now, but we're putting it down, and I think that's one of the things that we absolutely have to do. We have to communicate clearly about what the system looks like and how best to access it, and what you can expect to be accessed.
I'm sorry, I just have to bounce off of it, Dick, I'm sorry. I think, and I said this at another meeting with Jesse not long ago, there's so many people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and those that we don't deal with, unfortunately, that are not internet savvy, that are not getting the word out.
And
that's a big hole for
Yep.
everybody.
It's a great reminder that even though we've turned the corner, so I'm going to digress. I heard the story this morning, a 116-year-old woman,
Yes.
her birthday, did you hear that? Birthday? And she wrote a letter to Zuckerberg because, whatever his name is, the Facebook guy, because she couldn't get on Facebook because until her true age, because it stopped at 1905. So we shouldn't make any assumptions about people that are old and not using it, but there are people that will not use technology and do those things, so we have to find alternative ways. But I will say from our standpoint, and I'm embarrassment's not the right word, but it is not, it's not acceptable from the HHS standpoint and from my standpoint that our website is so unuser friendly, because that ought to be the place where the vast majority of people can go and get information. We have to change that, again, hopefully quickly, but that's it. But recognize that there are people that don't use those.
Okay. This is not an innovations question, and I'm not even sure it's DHSS. I don't know where the rule comes
Good.
from.
I hope it's somebody else that we can blame.
It might. But in licensed group homes that many of our adults are in, there is the 60-bed therapeutically room. And if you have a family who is involved, and the adult child wants to come home on the weekends and goes to camp for a week and spends a week on family vacation, and you're over that 60-bed limit. And it seems very counterintuitive to person-centered planning and using natural supports if you then won't let them go home.
So the problem is
Unintentional design.
There's some design, but then, I do want to say this, there are competing interests. And so let's use, if you're a provider, right, and you get paid only when somebody is there, and we don't adjust your rates to include that 60 days that you're not going to be there, because you can't really, because somebody might use 10, and then if you adjust them to say that 60, you're really overpaying, then the provider is a problem, because they're not going to be able to provide a service for everybody else. So there are competing interests. There is, it seems to be again, and I don't want to say that individual budget solves all the problems in the world, because it doesn't. But if the budget is $50,000 and somebody's living in a residential setting, and that's what the budget is, and somebody wants to spend 60 days at home, again, I'm not so sure why we care then. Because we've done what we should have done, right? We paid attention to what the money is. As long as health and safety is met, then it no longer is an issue. So, but there's a licensure rule or some other thing out there that we'll have to address, and there's some other thing that somebody else has. But I think, again, going back to I really believe that policy should be consistent. You know, you should talk about public policy. Public policy ought to start from one place, and everything from that cascades down. And so our public policy view is that we really believe that by setting individual budgets really is how you do individual, you do person-centeredness, and you change the system design. Then everything from that has to change. And that policy around some restrictiveness that we have in residential settings has to change. Some of our, again, you know, we complicate things so much. LME-MCO responsible for the funding and the waiver, health service regulatory, our state division responsible for licensure things. It's convoluted, right? So we've got to clean that up. We've got to decide who's accountable and who's responsible, hold them accountable and responsible for it, and you can't continue to complicate it. So I don't know the answer, but I think going in this direction, at least for innovations waiver funding, that might address that issue. Again, if we get to the point to where we're doing everything based on individual budget, then I think we eliminate the problem.
Can that happen by 2016? Can that be a part of the new waiver? Or,
I will tell you, individual budget will be part of the new waiver. How much, I would like to see us to do a lot more flexible service definitions in the new waiver. I want to do that. Some of the regulatory things that we may be able to take off because we've gone to this will take longer, because you'll have to do it first and then you'll have to get it taken off. But now's the time to start the list, right? What are the things that if we do this and it's working, we can get rid of? And so it won't happen overnight, but I think that is the plan that we're trying to achieve.
it, from a service definition issue, people who have significant needs who are living at home who need more than 12 hours a day of care, is that on your list to look at?
Just got
Capped out services, I think, is what she's getting at.
Say it again.
Capped out services, in other words, you can't have more than so many hours of personal care. And
Well, you can have 12 hours a day, and some people can live at home,
Right.
choose to live at home, but they need more than 12 hours a day.
then they have to get enhanced.
And then they don't meet the criteria, and then, you know, you're talking a 3-bedroom or a 3-bed or a 6-bed residential place that can't provide the one-on-one care that they needed when they were home.
So again, I'm going to go back to the principle. So we design individual budgets based upon need and circumstance, and it's legitimate. We might address that, but the other side of this is that there is not this unlimited pot of money. And what I will say to you is that what we can't do as we go to this is all of a sudden have an increase in cost. What we have to do is essentially make this transition budget neutral. But
But if you've got people who have lived successfully receiving 17 hours a day of services and are under the 135,000, what difference does it make?
here's the problem. The 135 is a myth. It doesn't exist. They don't get 135,000. We don't budget 135,000. 135,000, if we budget 135,000, we'd spend $1 billion on a waiver versus the 500 million. It's always been that. It's been something that we should probably tell everybody up front when we start. There is not 135,000 sitting in some bank account available for services on a waiver. The average cost, it's always been the average cost budgeted. Once we went to the waiver, it's the average cost over the past 3 years with some other variations in it. But that's what it is. So, that's the problem.
Yeah, because that's not what I'm being told. I'm being told a set amount of money that my child receives, and we're doing self-determination.
Right.
So I'm setting these things, but I've got an amount of money.
If you don't have 135,000,
No, no. I've got a certain amount of money that they're telling me that we have to provide the services that we provide.
because you're doing self-determination, you've made the leap already.
Oh,
What we're trying to get is that's what we're with everybody. There's a real budget, and that's kind of a fake budget, the way we do that, I think. I think it's real, something that is a budget. But
But
it's closer to where you want, that's where we want to be. But it won't be 135,000. It cannot, this is facts of life. If we ever have any intention of getting more people off the waiting list, this process has to be budgeted.
But you talk about health and safety first, and people who are living at home who need more than 12 hours a day, who are under that mythical $135,000 amount that I realize doesn't exist, who are healthy, safe, and living at home, may have to go into a residential setting where they don't get the one-on-one care that they get at home, and so you save money and the health and safety. How do you make that?
That is a balance, and I'll say, again, there's no intention, of forcing people into more restrictive environments. But, so if you turn that off, I'll say something.
Oh, no, this is public.
Huh?
This is public.
Okay, I won't say it.
You don't want to say it, don't say it.
So what I'll say to you is that there are some people who believe that everybody has the right to live in their own apartment with all the support wrapped around them, and that everybody that receives service from our system, that's what we should do. I don't believe that. Because you don't have the right to live in your own apartment. And we have an obligation to manage the amount of money, the taxpayer dollars, in a way that is responsible. And if we did that, we would have no money left to do anything else. So somewhere there's a balance. Now, I don't know what the balance is, and I think that's the sort of negotiation process that goes on, but we can't guarantee everybody that we're gonna provide enough funding in an innovation waiver slot that you can live by yourself in your own home with all of these services wrapped around. You can't guarantee that. We can guarantee that we're gonna create a process that's equitable and fair, that takes into account of these things, and that you'll have a way to adjudicate it if you don't agree with it, but at some point in time, because we're rationing resources no matter what, that we're creating a system to ration those resources in a way that is logical, and that's what we want to get to, so that we can serve all those people that need something, that don't get anything. But that's really not yet, Walter, not yet.
I want to offer a suggestion to help.
Well, you are.
No, I have one. I actually have
Go ahead.
a person that has this kind of issue that we've been trying to resolve, because it is costing the state more money, because they're having to use enhanced personal care to meet those extra hours. And they live in constant fear of possibly losing their independence and their life. But what would be helpful is, even though you had those limits, which I understand why you have to have them, but in the person-centered thinking, person-centered plan model, the whole idea is that's a living document around that individual. If the justification, because they don't need enhanced personal care, they need personal care. And the personal care would suffice, and it would save the state money. And I think if you could have some mechanism in there that says justify, allow us to see that, then we can do it.
So, and I'll add the other side of it, is that if the individual budget is set right, then again, why do we care if it's enhanced personal or personal care?
Right.
It's a service.
It's a service.
I'm going to go back to, I don't care if it's habilitation or not habilitation, as long as the person's getting what they needed. Because we all know that that even when people are getting habilitation hours, a whole bunch of time that people aren't doing habilitation. And so we kind of make people not tell the truth about it. A bunch of time is personal care, and really what you're looking for is a enhanced rate to pay a higher level of money to the staff that are coming in. I mean, that's, so let's quit all the games, is what we're trying to say, and get back to honesty about what we're doing, and that's the process that we want to get to. So Ron, that's how you go. Walter, that was good, because it was a suggestion.
See, I'm not always great control.
What I'm about to say, I'm saying it as a parent. Katie's 27 years old. I am a planner, and I've been involved in this process for day one. He's not on the waiting list. I don't even know if it would be advantageous to us at this point to have him on the waiting list. You've heard me say this, and I'll say it again, over and over again. This is my child's world, just like it is anybody else's. And this is great that we're talking about this, but we've been doing this for as long as I've been in the system. And I'm running out of time. Katie's running out of time. And I just want something, we're making do with what we have because we have to. But we're running out of time, and we've got to do something.
So even if I didn't know you, I would say that's the kind of, that this is why we have to do something. This is why the Secretary sent us on a road. Because one is that families should not live in fear that if something happens to them, they don't know what's going to happen to their son or daughter. There are incredible amounts of really, families that have done this forever. People are committed, they don't want to do anything different, but what they want to know is there's hope and there's some stability going forward. And I think that is the responsibility of the state. That's what we should be about. It means, though, we have to have a logical system in which we can allocate those resources. And that is what we're trying to do.
Is there not a way for the people on the waiting list that there's an assessment before they are offered all these services to assess what their needs are? I just got a client recently who is very, very high functioning. In my opinion, he should have never gotten innovations. And the money, and then all of a sudden, as soon as they were told we done innovations, his family just demanded every minute they could get. And all that money that's going for him could have served 3 people. You know, that their parents needed to work, and they need a day program, or they need, and that's all we need. So there needs to be some kind of assessment before they're told they have all this money and all these hours to determine what the real need is.
That's, again, system design problem.
Yeah, it really, I mean, it
That's a great
really
recommendation.
makes you mad when you see that this one person is getting the moon and somebody else over here can't get
And
it.
was surviving without all, and was, I don't want to step on the whole foot, but functioning in, at least for me, in programs with a lower level of care.
But I will, and I don't know this person or any of this stuff, but I will defend why people do that. For the same reason why somebody worried about what happens when I'm not hearing. Because our system right now, it is a lottery. You win it, you get an innovation slot, and you know that at least you got something long term. And so I think that's what happens to people when they wind up there. Now, again, there might be something else going on there, but that's not a smart system. That's a system design problem.
I'm still having a hard time, I guess, because I feel like that when they do come into the system, my understanding is there is an assessment that is done. There is a person-centered plan that is wrote from a care coordination perception, not from a provider perception. So that should be happening if we're utilizing what we're supposed to be doing now.
Okay, I think the way I describe it, and this is not the technical term of it, is that what we have right now is it's a building block process, all right? Come in, you do person-centered plan, and you kind of pick and choose from all of these services that are available, and people see that. It's like going to the
Candy store.
yeah, not the candy store, but what is that, the buffet, and so you're picking all those other things off. Well, what we don't have is that sort of break. And that's what we're looking for, the break. The break is that the need is assessed in individual circumstances, and so here's the break. It's 30,000, and we're not gonna go over that, because this is what the number is, and for somebody that has less needs, maybe it's 20.
Well, didn't you lose
You do,
utilization managers?
so my guess is that all of you, anybody who is a provider, will have a story about how they can't stand what utilization management did, right? And you are, and I can't imagine why you want to work there, because it can't be the funnest place to be, right? But thank God people do. But the system with design creates these, in some ways, arbitrary decisions that people have to make. They're not really arbitrary, but they're based on things. But what we need is a system that is constant, that says this is what it is. This is, again, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, he's just rationing what's going on when you think about the individual budget. Absolutely. But right now, how we're rationing is whether or not you get your number picked versus whether or not, once you get your number picked, that we've done the right thing and done that. And that's really, in my wildest dreams, what I would hope is that sometime in the relatively near future, and I don't know what that is, let's just say 10 years, I hope less, that we're not talking about a waiting list. That's not what it's about. What it's about is that people who need services, who are eligible services, get them. But what they get are the services they need, and that their circumstances demand, but we don't have this wild fluctuation between what two people under similar circumstance get. That's one of the things that we can't.
Dave?
Yes, ma'am. Go from back here.
How is the individual chosen off the list, and how can providers find out in regard to the clients that you serve, where that individual is on the list? Like if you have 15 state individuals that are on the list, can the providers find out where they are on the list?
I'm going to turn it around and say it this way, is that right now, I'm not so sure we can do that well. Right? And these guys might have an ability to tell you those things you talk to them. But what we've heard in lots of places is that if you're going to have a waiting list, one of the things that has to be in place is that people have some reasonable knowledge of where they're on it and is it 5 years, is it 2 years, what's the number, what you can expect. And I don't know how we get there yet, but I think that's one of the tricks that we have to come up with, is how do you reasonably predict what happens when you're on a waiting list, so we're not overinflating hope, right? So you tell people not the truth, but at the same time, there's some logic to the process. So I don't think we can answer it maybe after you can let them, but I don't think we can answer it, and I'm not sure that LMEMCO can answer it right now.
In this new system, am I hearing you correctly, that there might be a possibility, or might be wishful thinking, that IDD will be pulled out of the medical model because of the habilitation and the recovery? Is that what I heard?
So what I would say to you is that it's Medicaid money.
Right.
And so there's a lot of Medicaid money here. Medicaid, but that Medi in there, that medical thing, right? So the Medicaid side says there's this whole medical necessity words, all those other things we don't like. But the trend in states, and the view in states, and I think with CMS, is that so for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and these habilitative waivers, the home and community-based waivers, is that their expectation that's different. It's not the same thing as you think about a medical issue around somebody who has mental illness, because it is a medical issue. So CMS will say it's a support waiver, all right? They'll use those words. It's about supports. And so I think we can do that. I think we did it for ourselves. We won't get, in the Medicaid program, you won't get away from some of that language, because you'll have to. Again, our principle is it's not a recovery system, it's a support system. That's what we believe, that's what we say, that's what we're saying everywhere. And I'll tell you this, I think sometimes the things that LMEMCOs do that appear to be based on a recovery model are based on a system design we put in place. We'll get into technical details, but the way we fund it is just, it doesn't allow the kind of flexibility to create a support system. So yes, the answer is yes. Not that we're not going to do, we will still have to do CMS things.
Yes.
Yes, we want to get away from the idea that this is a recovery-based system, that it is a support system.
So no more step downs.
I wouldn't say, that's not, and I want to be real careful with that, because there are certain services that people get that should be stepped down. Supported employment is a great example of that. So if you're in supported employment, and the job coach doesn't fade, then you're not doing supported employment. What you're doing is subsidizing employment. And frankly, so don't take me serious on this, but I'll tell you, is we'd be better off with some of those folks if we never fade, just saying, here's a check, because we're spending so much money. Now, that's something we'll do, but you've got to fade if you're doing supported employment, because that's what the model says. So I think we got to distinguish between fading and recovery. There are some services, even in a support system, that you want to fade, but the principles have to be it's long-term support.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're doing. So I think you got to. I want to be cautious. We don't.
The retraining also comes into play.
Sure. So if you're doing supported employment, I mean, the model, you guys know the model. You know what was originally set up. The model that we've all based this on was that you do the intensive placement, intensive work up front. That's why VR was the original link to do that. You do that for a certain period of time. You have an accompanying, and the original legislation, I think it still is there, doesn't allow for VR to pay for long-term support, because the intention was to link with the time it was just developmental disability system for those long-term supports, which were intended to fade down and only be used when people needed them. So the goal was is you'll fade, but they'll always be there. So if you're on a job for 10 years, that person can keep going back, but the expectation wasn't going to be there every day. The expectation is we're going to continue to check, and that's what we should be doing. But I will tell you, we've sort of sometimes lost our way in that, and that what we do is supported employment forever, and we never try to get people more comfortable on the job site to where we do actually fade it. So we got to be true to that model too.
Well, I think some of your challenges though with that is transportation, especially here in the mountain area. We might could get them there, if we had somebody that could get them to work, then they might could stay with employment, but the reality is getting them there, somebody doing medications and stuff like that. So it becomes a challenge in what we were wanting to have happen. There's other barriers.
I'm not saying that system was perfect either, right, when you think about it. But I think, again, what I was just trying to make sure that
I think if you, the support.
It wouldn't be fading, because there has to be something.
The support thing is the main thing. If you have ongoing support of some kind, shape, or form to maintain it, because VR, that was always a problem. They get a job, they get trained, you get them on the job, they may live for 10 years, 5 years, and then something happens, they have mental crisis issues or whatever, and they lose their job.
You know, that's why the model was developed, because of that.
So there needs to be some other supports.
Going bigger picture, because you talked about innovations in 2016. So we'll talk, legislature's talking, maybe pull Medicaid out of DMA's in chaos, it seems like. Senate wants to either bring in private insurance companies or leave it public MCOs. I don't know about, I love the idea of competition and choice of my insurance company, because I think that drives down cost and would help drive down their cost, and drive down our cost, and raise up quality. So I love the idea, I know they don't, but competition I think is always great. Where's the governor standing on this? Where are we gonna be, do you think? Because that's gonna have a huge impact on families, providers, everybody.
So you
in
know,
2016.
Governor has a Medicaid reform plan that he put out there. I work for the secretary who works with governor. We have a Medicaid reform plan that we put out there. That's what our vision is. In terms of taking Medicaid out, I think my personal opinion is that, so if you take what I think we heard from the other day, from Medicaid directors of the state that did it, so you can take the functions of Medicaid, put it somewhere else, but you still got to do all the other things that you already do. So what's the big gain from that? And I'll tell you, this is my sort of moment of, not political, but just a description of what we've been trying to do, is that our vision is that inside the department, we are integrated, and it's working that way. But the other day, you know, Robin Cummings and I talk every day, and we talk about our system every day. And so I also talk to, obviously, Courtney at Mental Health, and Dale and DSOP, and almost every day, Sherry Bratcher, who's over the human service side, which is where VR is. And so it's a collaborative effort, but Medicaid money is spread right all over, because we all use that system. We manage the MCO system as a state, as a collaborative. It's not a DMA, DMH thing. Sometimes it feels that way for them, but we do it collectively because it's the only way you can do it. So, my opinion, if you take Medicaid out, all you've done is created more transformation issues, and it'll take 2 or 3 years for that to settle down. So why do that now? That makes no sense. If, 10 years from now, when we've got a system that's all in place and you think it's still a good idea, think about doing it right now, but not when you're trying to do this heavy lift of changing things to get integrated care and to make it work. So
what do you do with ACOs versus private insurance companies versus?
the governor
how does that?
has a plan.
Well, the governor does, but how you see that? I mean, how is that going to fit?
Here's what I think the principles that we started with, and the reason why, when we first started this plan, the secretary came out and said we ought to have 3-ish big managed care companies do that. She started out because that was some of the advice that people gave her, right, to do that. Well, the other thing that the governor said and the secretary said immediately was, we're going to go out and listen to people what they say. And as we listen to them, we'll adjust that and come back to the General Assembly with the plan we think makes sense. So my job was to go out and listen to what people said around behavioral health. And almost everywhere, what people said was, and I'll be honest, some people said, we may not like the LME-MCO system as it's working, we don't think it's good, but don't change the blasted thing, you just started it, right? Don't do something different right now, because several principles in there is that specialty care, there's a reason for it. People have special needs, so don't lump it in with something where nobody understands that. We've been through enormous amounts of transformation, so at least let us hang with the people that we know, and, even if we're not happy, we can fix it and stay consistent. Well, on the medical side, the same thing came out, is that providers and other folks would say the same thing, is that, let's build upon what works here. The CCNC thing, people around the country have been saying, one of those models that has brought us a long way. Maybe it needs to be evolved, but don't throw it out, Don't say to the docs and the hospitals that you're going to go work for some private managed care company. Let them describe what it looks like in the future. And that's what we're looking for, is that kind of build upon what we have. Don't tear down what we have. That is the governor's plan. And that's where we're at, and that's my story.
Not to be rude, but what happens when we have a new governor and that's no longer the plan?
Well, part of what I would hope you would say is that you want this General Assembly in a long session to make final decisions, so that we put it in law, and we move in that direction, so we don't change it if there's a new governor in 2 years or 6 years.
So is this gonna happen before? Is this going to happen for sure at the next General Assembly? Or is it gonna be another, because we're coming up for reelection?
We're proposing our plan
But
to
then-
the general assembly.
And not to be rude, Dave, but
That's fine. You can do it.
we are the parents of an autistic daughter. And we have been here for 9 years, and we were in 9 years, she's gonna be 18. We were 9 years in the other state that we were in. We supposedly have been looking at other models from other states. And this is not to be rude, this is the third time in the 9 years that we have attended this exact same meeting. And so when I say that, it's with all due respect, you know, because you hear it every time. And it's like she said, we're running out of time.
No,
And then we're just living day to day.
I can't agree with you more. We have reformed the system over and over again, and every time we reform it, we don't stick to it. Part of that was the message that was absolutely clear. Stick to something. Follow that forward and do something about fixing it. We started out, I'm going to emphasize it again. The reason why we're here is we want to hear, right? And it's everything we want to hear. That's going down to, so let's make sure we do that. What I can guarantee you is that from the place I work, that there's been no change from that commitment to sticking to a system going forward. And that's what all I can control is that. Now, I think the governor is going to do everything in the world he can to make sure that we have legislation this year, that everybody can come around, and as legislation happens, it'll be compromised, but that follows these principles. And that's what we want to go, so that there's stability and some confidence that what happens long-term is consistent.
I will say this, and I think that it would behoove all of us to bring all of us to the table in larger groups. Because when you come to these meetings, there are few and far between from representation from the different levels. I can say, as being a parent and not working in the industry that you all work in, or many of you, that it's overwhelming and frustrating to sit here on all sides. I hear you and I hear us. When you talk about changing service definitions, that may work for those of you who work in the system every day, but for us parents, unless you are getting a degree in social services and legislation, we can't keep up. And a lot of times we do feel that the service terms and things are changed just to keep us jumping. And then for a lot of people that are in the service industry, the consumer, a lot of those people don't even have the time or the educational background to even understand it. Listening to all of these things tonight, I've taken all kinds of notes so I can go home and Google it, so I can figure out what you're talking about. And I consider myself to be fairly educated.
But once you get that figured out, then they'll change your
That's
mind.
exactly it. So when we talk about service definitions, and I understand this is not something we can work on here, but when the money comes from the federal government, if it's autism in this state, it's autism in that state. If it's home-based community services in this state, it should be the same all the way down. And if it's federal dollars, that's one of the things that we should all strive for, because if we could get our service definitions down, where they could not change those, at least we could build on something that we could keep understanding, because we can't keep up.
So I'm going to add this, and then you can tell me what time.
Yeah.
You asked and correct. And so what I would say is that, why do we make a system so complicated so that a mom and dad can't figure out what it is, right? No matter how, I had a woman the other night said, I'm a PhD scientist and all this other stuff, and I can't figure out what the heck you're saying. That doesn't make sense. For you, what it ought to be, this is what we need. And why do you care about the service definitions, right? I mean, that shouldn't be your problem. Your problem should be, this is what we need to support our son and daughter to have the best life you can in the community. Here, and what we should say, here are the available resources. This is what we have, this is what we bring. And let's write a plan that doesn't have any of this stupid jargon in it about what's needed. So rather than talking about habilitation, let's talk about, we want to learn how to do this thing because it would make his life better. Rather than talking about all of his other language, I want to say, it'd be really cool if he had an iPad that he could use because it could help him communicate. Maybe that's the answer. I want a job. I don't care about supported employment, I want a job. That's what he wants. So let's get rid of that jargon, but that's what we're trying to describe, and did obviously inartful job of doing that. That's what we want to get to, because we have complicated this thing so much at your level, it makes no sense.
I think for listening.
Oh, I'm saying for everybody. No, it's.
I mean, I think, I feel empathy, and I have to feel also resentment. I feel empathy for those of you who work with us every day, because a lot of the problem is that there's so much animosity between the consumer and the providers and the queues and everyone, because they're told something, we're told something, we all go back and forth, and there's this mistrust also that has come out of all of this for all of us. And so therefore, it's also, it raises the level of inability to work together to actually get to where you want to be. I mean, I think I hear everyone saying at this point, and I know that we're at this point, is I don't think we care anymore. Let's just do it. Let's just see some results, and let's say, okay, this isn't working, and fix it. But my gosh, Dave, this is not to be ugly to you. Every meeting that we've gone to is a whole new different group of people, and that's.
You mean?
Well, you're a different person. Every time we've gone to this meeting that we've had these conversations,
right.
It's a different person, and we just want to get it done. So what do we have to do besides tell you what we need? What do we have to do, all of us, to get change and have effect?
Okay, so
what do we do to affect change?
Perfect way to sort of end the formal part of it, because I know we started late, so we'll stick around, but it's 8:41. Let's check that. I did mention this. So my position is Deputy Secretary in DHHS. It doesn't matter that I'm in it. It matters that there's a position called Deputy Secretary for Behavioral Health and IDD. The reason why that was created is because Secretary felt that two things. One is we want to integrate at our community side along with our facility side. The second part, though, is that you wanted somebody inside the Secretary's office. And you wanted a position sort of, if it's the right word to say it, that it is consistent. That regardless of what administration's in there, that's something that is a culture that belongs, that position there, because this is important. And it ought to be inside the Secretary's office, not somewhere else. That's one. The idea that that's there is a commitment to let's get this right. Second thing is that you're absolutely right. I've been around for 20 years in this thing, 25 years, and we change it over and over again. And every time we reform it, we confuse the heck out of people, and we make it more complex. Some of this stuff is complex. How federal money gets down, how we manage it to get to these guys and this other stuff, that's complex. What highly trained professional therapists and other folks that work with people with disabilities, that's complex. But your process to receive services should not be. That should be easy. We have to figure out how to get past the rationing as a lottery system and all those things. But it should be the easiest part. You should be able to sit down with somebody and say, here's what we need as a family. This will help us. This is how it'll work. And we convert that to all this jargon. Yes, you shouldn't have to worry about it. But we've created, and this is, I think what we've done, is we've created a system by which families feel they have to know more about the system than the people in the system to get what they need. And so we've got to turn around. It's wrong. What we want to do is simplify that part. Now, I can't do anything about the fact that we've had this meeting, 15 times. I feel like I've been in too from other places. What I can tell you from our standpoint, the time that we're there, that we came out, the reason why we're here, the reason why we're in Wilmington on Monday, is because we didn't want to rely upon secondhand information. We wanted to see people, hear it in a way you wanted to say it, so that when I go back to the Secretary, and I do it every week and explain to her what we're hearing, that she hears the truth about what's going on in our system. She hears about what people want and desire. And there's nothing that you haven't said that people haven't said to you. Simplify it. Stop all of this bizarreness and stick with something. Don't keep changing.
We just want to love our children.
Right. You want to be moms and dads and don't want to be, you don't have to be the expert in how the hell we get money to smoking. That should not be your problem. And it shouldn't be your problem, frankly, in the long run. You shouldn't care what we decide on Medicaid reform. In the end day, what you really should care about is that you get services that is a better system for you and you have access to those services. But we're not there yet. What the close I can tell you is that our commitment is this, is that we're taking everything back, We're gonna process everything. We'll tell you what we can do from what you told to us. We'll tell you when we can do it, and we'll tell you what we can't do. And we'll just be honest about it, because, we can't, the worst thing we can do to create trust in the system is to tell you we're gonna do something we can't do. So we're gonna tell you the things we can, and we're gonna try to get it done, and we're gonna try to do it in the fastest way possible, so that your lives are different. That's really what we're about. That's what we're trying to do. So, you were absolutely right to say it the way you did. And I think we all heard it, and the secretary will hear it on Monday. George, last thing, and then Brian.
I'm gonna give you a great comment and let that be it. So George, you can yell at me for not getting the last word in here.
Okay.
But,
You will.
Yeah, I'll disagree with you on one point. You said, not tongue in cheek, it didn't matter that you were in that position. You're kind of giving us a description of things. And I disagree. It does matter you're in this position, because what I see in you, what we see in you here tonight, you have, his expertise is phenomenal. I mean, there's people don't walk around with the knowledge base you have, and the combination of that with your, I'll say, stamina, and transparency in the way you've done this, and the ability to just, keep on. It's very frustrating. It's terribly frustrating. But, is what we say at Smoky, just, come to work tomorrow. Stay with it. So you deserve a lot of credit for it.
Appreciate that. And George can't.
I'll echo what Brian said, okay? But my specific question, you said you've been talking all across the state, take it back to Raleigh, we're gonna put it together, analyze it, blah, blah, blah. Can there be, will there be an opportunity for this statewide listening sessions to have a summary
Oh, yeah.
that can be distributed?
Absolutely. That's a great
Maybe not
question.
put on your website, but somebody's website, that we can access.
If you put it on our website, you won't find it.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, that's it. Well, I'll tell you, it's already
In
in.
a reasonable period of time, because I think, isn't this session one of the last?
We have 2 more weeks of session.
2 more weeks, so
No,
sometime by
Absolutely. You will have
first of
summary.
December, or?
Oh, no, we summarize as we're going on. So
But
we'll
I mean,
have it
there's a lot of
mid-November.
overlap. Yeah.
On our website. We'll get the LME MCOs, provider associations, everywhere else. I mean, we're going to get it out. That's one of our commitments. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you all. I just want to say thank you all for coming here tonight. We're going to sit around a little bit, so talk and